Welcome to Conversations by BrandKnew, Todd. It's indeed a privilege and a pleasure to be talking to you. And let me begin right at the beginning by asking you, I'm sure our audience would like to know something about your growing up years, your early childhood influences. Could you talk us through that, please?
Of course. So I grew up in a very rural environment. I was surrounded by farms, cornfields, soybean fields. So I spent a lot of time on my bike, just riding all over, miles and miles and miles, all by myself. Um, which was, a lot of people would think that sounds very boring and it sounds miserable to grow up in an environment like that. But for someone who eventually worked my way into the creative spaces, it was a gift. My friends and I, we couldn't just go to the movies, we couldn't just go shopping. We had to figure out how to entertain ourselves. So we built helicopters out of lawnmower engines. We built, we would do all of these crazy, we made movies. We did all kinds of things to keep ourselves entertained. And because of that, I think I, from a very early age, began dwelling in the realm of possibility instead of just thinking about practicality or what most interests me now, but what could I make? What could I do? What could I produce and bring into the world? So I'm very grateful for those early years. I went on to university. I studied marketing in school, graduated school, and music had been a passion of mine since I was very young. So I
I
performed
could see the
music for a
piano in the
few years.
background.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yes, it's still very much a part of my passion area, my portfolio of passions. Now it's something I do for fun on the side, but for a couple of years it was my full-time profession right out of college. I thought, hey, this would be a great opportunity for me to pursue something and see what happens. I ended up, as the story goes, I ended up meeting a girl, and she convinced me maybe music wasn't the best future path for me. So I took a job in an organization, became creative director of that organization, worked there for about a decade. And in the midst of that, I started a podcast called The Accidental Creative. And this was in 2005. So very early in the podcasting world, in the timeline. And the podcast took off, gained some followers, and I began receiving invitations to come and teach some of the principles I was speaking about at organizations and in other places. And I left my job in 2009 to start my own consultancy, my own consulting practice called Accidental Creative. And now, since then, the last 12 years, 14 years, I've written 6 books now, and get to travel all over the world and see all kinds of wonderful places and meet interesting people, teaching them how to be creative under pressure.
Lovely, lovely. Good for you. And talk about creativity. I think it can lead us nicely segue into the next question. The world could do with more creativity. As they say,
Mhm.
creativity is future proof. You want
Yes.
to talk about that? Can you elaborate something on that?
Absolutely. Well, I think first it's good for us to come up with a common definition of what creativity is, because I think we sometimes conflate creativity with art. People think I'm not creative because I don't design, because I don't make music, because I'm not one of those people, the creatives, as we call them.
Right. Yeah.
But the reality is, creativity is problem solving. So if you have to solve problems every day, you have to be creative, period. And a designer solves a problem by designing something, but a manager solves a problem by developing a system or inventing a new kind of conversation to have with a client in order to secure business. All of those things are creative acts. And so when we have to create under pressure in the face of uncertainty, we're often ill equipped to do so, because many people rely on their talent. They wing it, they shoot from the hip, they react in the moment, but they don't have practices in their life to prepare them for those moments when they need to be brilliant. And most of my work has focused on helping people develop practices in their life to prepare them for those moments when they have to deliver under pressure at a moment's notice.
Lovely, lovely. So we talk about being a creator. So your journey of becoming a creator, a writer, was it a scripted path or was it an accidental discovery? Which probably kind of got embedded during your early childhood growing up years.
Yeah, I would say it's a combination of both. And I think most people would say the same about their career. I am now almost 50 years old. So I've got 5 decades under my belt. And I would say that as I look back, I could not have predicted where I ended up. If I were looking forward, I could never have predicted I would be doing this today. But looking back, everything makes a lot of sense. I like to say that creativity is not efficient, but it doesn't waste anything. So all of my experiences, even my early 20s, I jokingly call them my misguided 20s, my years as a musician. I joke because I don't want my children doing the same thing I did. But when I look back on that, I realized, I had to be in front of audiences and figure out how to win them over. I had to figure out how to connect with people. And all of that was helpful in making presentations and presenting ideas, getting in front of potentially hostile groups of people and having to win them over to my side of an argument. All of those things were useful in that process. And I think sometimes we think that, well, this isn't relevant. That's not going to help me in the future. But if my friend Mitch Joel calls it the squiggly line. Most careers are not a linear path, they're a squiggly line. And so as you consider where you want to go with your career, it's always a helpful thing to look at the pieces, the bits and pieces you have, and ask, how can these bits and pieces be combined into something that provides value to other people? Most people don't work their way into the role that they are uniquely capable of fulfilling until they are well into their career. For me, it was in my late 30s before I realized I wanted to be a writer. That wasn't something that was in the cards for me. I was a creative director. I led designers, I led writers, I led other people, but I didn't think, oh, I want to go out and write books and teach and speak until I was in my late 30s. The picture began to become clear for me. And so I think, often people, especially new people in the market, people who are newer to the marketplace, younger people in their career, I think often they want answers now. They want to know, what is my thing? What is the single thing that I'm supposed to do? And the reality is, there is no single thing. You're going to do a lot of things in your career, and your unique contribution, the place where you add the most value, your sweet spot, is going to develop more like film in a dark room than like a digital snapshot. It's going to become clear over time as you have more experiences. And so we have to ask, how can I leverage these experiences in my life to position me to add value in ways that are unique to me? And once we begin to be able to answer that question, I think that's when we start to experience career breakthrough in our lives, in our work.
Yeah, you talk about work, and in fact, pardon the bias, I think Die Empty is one of the most purposefully provocative book titles, one of my all-time favorites. I would like to understand how the book came into your mind. I'm sure it is a combination, a culmination of something that you've been observing and soaking in over an extended period of time.
Yeah. So in the very, very beginning of the book, I share the story of a meeting I was in. This was 25 years ago now, maybe. I was in the meeting and people were we were considering a decision organizationally that was a bit of a risk organizationally, and there were millions of dollars at stake. And I think everybody felt a little bit nervous about making the decision to move forward. And so the person leading the meeting suspected that nervousness and stopped the meeting, and out of the blue said, "What do you think is the most valuable land in the world?" And we're all thinking, it's a weird question. I don't know. That's a very strange question. And so we started throwing out guesses, oil fields, gold mines, Manhattan real estate. We started throwing out all these guesses. And he said, "You're all wrong. You're all wrong." He said, and he was quoting the late Miles Monroe. I found out later he was quoting the late Miles Monroe. He said, "The most valuable land in the world is the graveyard, because in the graveyard are buried all of the unwritten novels, all of the unexecuted ideas, all of the value that people carried around with them." And they thought, tomorrow I'll do that. Tomorrow I'll get around to that. And they pushed it into the future until one day all of that value was buried with them, dead in the ground. And that hit me in a very profound way, because I realized there were things in my life I was allowing to remain inside of me that I needed to put out. And it could be reconciling a relationship. It could be having a conversation. It could be introducing an idea. It could be writing. It could be teaching something. Whatever it is, I knew that I did not want that to remain inside of me. So I went back to my office that day and I wrote 2 words on an index card and put them on the wall of my office. And those 2 words were "Die Empty," because I wanted to know that when I reached the bookend of my life, I wasn't taking my best work to the grave. And so that stayed with me for years and years and years after that experience. And when the time came to write my second book, I thought, well, this is actually, I think, a really great title for a book. And I checked and I couldn't believe that that title hadn't already been used in any capacity by anyone else. And so I thought, okay, this would be a great way to encapsulate this set of ideas about areas where organizations and people get stuck. So the book really contains 7 common areas where people get stuck: aimlessness, boredom, comfort, delusion, ego, fear, and guardedness. But Die Empty really is a great container, I think, for all of those, because if we get stuck in those areas, we're not going to get our best work into the world.
Absolutely. And just to extend to that, I must confess, I used this thing about the most expensive piece of real estate on earth being the graveyard in one of my blog posts. I'll send that link to you. And I
Wonderful.
think,
Yeah.
yeah, I'd use that actually. And I think it's a phenomenal piece of work. And congratulations. Absolutely.
Thank you so much. And again, the sentiment of the book is not new. You know, it's been echoed in the words and teaching of many people over time. And even the person who was leading that meeting, they were quoting Miles Monroe, right? So and I think as best as I can tell, he was the originator of that sentiment. But you know, nobody had really ever captured that and applied it to a business context. And I think that was sort of the unique spin maybe I put on it, was applying it to the business context. And obviously the 7 areas, I call them the 7 deadly sins. Those 7 areas were unique to the book, but that sentiment of Die Empty, I think, captures what many of us suspect but have a difficult time putting into words.
Absolutely. I know you're a big brand ambassador for authenticity and an increasingly make-believe world where there is question mark put on, are you courageous enough to stand naked in your own truth?
Mm-hmm.
Authenticity comes at a premium because you're always trying
Yes.
to be the other person that you're not actually. That especially
Right.
with social media exposure and what have you. What do you have to say to that, Todd?
So yes, authenticity is essential. It is in the workplace. If you want to succeed, you need to exhibit authenticity. But I think we often confuse authenticity with transparency. Authenticity means showing people what you care about, wearing that on your sleeve, and being willing to spend yourself, to put skin in the game and spend yourself on behalf of what you care about. When people suspect that you are authentic in that way, they trust you. Transparency means I'm just going to show you everything. I'm going to tell you everything I'm thinking. I'm going to reveal everything to you. And that's not really useful, especially in leadership. That's not useful. We can't afford to be overly transparent as leaders. Sometimes we have to keep our cards a little closer to our chest, you know, but we do have to be authentic, meaning we have to put skin in the game. We have to show people what we care about. We have to be willing to spend ourselves, even at personal cost, on behalf of what we say we believe. So these are the principles I believe in, and I'm willing, if necessary, to spend myself on behalf of the pursuit of these principles because they are a critical part of how I see myself in the world. So that's the difference, I think, in the way that we often talk about authenticity. We talk about authenticity sometimes as I'm just going to reveal my life on Instagram and show everybody everything I'm doing and thinking all the time. I don't find that terribly useful. As a matter of fact, most of those very authentic
Yeah,
presentations on Instagram are highly fabricated, not
right.
authentic at all. And or whatever medium, and the same with leaders. Sometimes leaders will get up and they'll pretend like they're being authentic, but you can smell it from a mile away if they're not, because they're not putting their actions where their words are. Trust has to be earned every day, and trust is the currency of creative teams. If we want to do brilliant, risk-taking work, we have to trust one another, because when the moment comes when we have to step out into unknown territory, unfamiliar territory, we need to trust that we're going to have one another's back. And the first step as a leader in doing that is ensuring that you're being authentic with your team and you're putting your actions where your words are.
Absolutely. I mean, talk about trust. Just a few weeks back, I had an opportunity to speak to Stephen Covey on his book, Trust and Inspire.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a huge arsenal, right? At an individual level, at a societal level, at a corporate level, and I don't know why it is not utilized. And you can still do wonderful top lines and bottom lines using trust as a huge arsenal. I think people miss the wood for the trees. They say that okay, we need to be opaque, we need to be kind of deceptive, we need to fly under the radar. So I completely agree
Right.
with you. And you also mentioned
Yes.
about leaders, and I'm sure you had a huge sense of insights and experience, which led you to be inspired to be writing Herding Tigers. Okay, what did you see in the ecosystem that you said, okay, I think this book is right? Because obviously, is there a vacuum across society, corporate, politics, government? Is there a leadership crisis that you see?
Yes, absolutely. Unquestionably, I think globally we're seeing a leadership crisis. I live in the U.S. and we're seeing Boy, on so many fronts, we're just seeing a tremendous leadership crisis here. People unwilling to do courageous things, and it's frustrating because I think we often conflate boldness with bravery, right? Um, and as leaders, we have to be willing to be brave. And to be brave means to spend yourself, even at personal cost, to spend yourself on behalf of a vision that you have for a better possible future. And we need that. I mean, we need leaders who are willing to be brave. Sometimes leaders are bold. They say things, but they don't back them up with action, or they're not really willing to spend themselves. They're not willing to do it at personal cost. I think the measure of any great leader is, am I willing to spend something valuable to me in order to achieve an objective that I care about? I think that's a huge measure of the effectiveness of leaders. So I am seeing a leadership crisis. I think largely it's because our incentives are misaligned from our objectives. I think we say one thing, but we incentivize another thing often in our organizations. And so people are going to do what gets rewarded. I think it was Peter Drucker who said that what gets rewarded gets done. And if our organizational incentives are misaligned from what we say we expect from people, people are going to do what they're getting rewarded for. Whatever we say, it doesn't matter. So if that means I'm going to do whatever it takes for me to get the biggest financial payoff necessary, that's what they're going to do. Yeah, building a culture is great. Yeah, taking care of our people is great. And we say those things and all of that. But really, at the end of the day, if the biggest incentive for me, the biggest metric that we're paying attention to is what is the bottom line and what's our shareholder value, if that's the biggest metric we really care about, I'm going to do whatever it takes as a leader to make sure that happens, regardless of all these other things, because at the end of the day, that's what you're measuring me on. So I think one of the challenges that we have as leaders and in organizations is that we often pay attention to trailing metrics, trailing measures. We don't pay attention to the leading measures that lead to those trailing measures. And I work with creative leaders all the time on this. We need to reward, instead of rewarding trailing measures like, oh, hey, we won this client, or hey, the client was happy, or hey, we made a bunch of money. We need to pay attention to the behaviors that are likely to lead to those outcomes and begin rewarding those behaviors. And that could look like somebody doesn't really speak up much in a meeting and suddenly they share an idea and we pull them aside after the meeting and we say, hey, I know that wasn't comfortable for you. I just wanted to let you know I saw that. I love that you did that. And I hope that we see more of that from you because we need you to contribute more to this meeting. We need your voice in the mix. That's an example of rewarding a leading behavior rather than a trailing indicator, which is what we often do. We only reward the results rather than the behavior. So I think for leaders, one of the things we need to pay attention to is instead of looking at shareholder value, which is a trailing measure of what we did, what are the kinds of behaviors and what is the kind of culture that's likely to lead to increase shareholder behavior or shareholder value for our owners, instead of just paying attention to those trailing measures? What are the behaviors we should be rewarding? When we begin thinking that way, it changes the way that we lead because we start looking for ways we can shape and guide behavior rather than just paying attention to the outcomes.
Yeah, which means actually just to extend into what you're saying, the psychological safety has to be a natural in any workplace or organization. It shouldn't be spoken about. You have the psychological safety. I'm not the hippo in the room, and I mean, you can address all of that. It's so natural. You might be an office boy or the junior most in the room in that meeting, but you can still come up with ideas that can be game changing. Yeah, so I think, yeah, exactly. I think, encourage participation and behavior rather than look at a metric which obviously you might not be having the entire consensus on that because you'll be, as a leader, you'll be measured only against that. But what about the rest of the tribe?
Right. That's exactly right. That is 100% right. And I think, we have to recognize that as leaders, our tendency is to want to step in and control. Our tendency is to want to come in and tell people what to do. When we do that, people turn their minds off. They don't, if we're just telling them what to do, we're teaching them tactics, but we're not teaching them how to think about the work. We're not teaching them the why behind the work. Jim Collins, in his great book, How the Mighty Fall, everybody loves to talk about good to great. They love to talk about, great by choice and some of these other books that are about great companies. But How the Mighty Fall, I think, is one of his most powerful works because he talks about how once great companies begin to decline, one of the first steps that he talks about in that book of decline is when People understand what works, but they have no idea why it works. They understand tactics, but they don't understand the strategy that led to those tactics. So they're just copying tactics. Well, what happens when the environment changes? What happens when the circumstances change? They don't know how to adapt their tactics because they don't understand why those tactics work to begin with. And a lot of organizations fall into this trap where they're just teaching people or telling people what to do, but they're not helping them understand why. Why does that work? What is the strategy here, not just the tactics? So as leaders, we have to enter into those conversations with our team as well and help them understand not just what works, but why it works, how we think about the work, how we make decisions, what are our criteria for choosing X versus Y. If we can do that, we can replicate that in our team, boy, our influence grows tremendously in the organization. But also we're creating an environment where our work, our influence can scale because now we have a bunch of people who can all think in the right way about the work. They don't just understand how to do the tactics, but they understand how to think about the work in a new way. So I call this having why chats with your team, or teaching the why behind the what. So critical if we want our team to be engaged and effective. We want to lead by influence, not by control within the organization.
Which actually prompts me to just share a thought. You must have read this book by Matthew Barzun called The Power of Giving Away Power.
I've not. I've heard of it, but I've not read the book. No.
It's an absolute seminal work. I highly encourage you to take a look at it. Exactly the kind of thing, because the power of giving away power. It sounds like oxymoronic, but it's so empowering. Exactly what you're alluding to now. I
I
think it's
love
worth a
that.
read. It's definitely worth a read. Yeah,
I love
yeah,
that.
yeah. I think in a few days' time, if I'm not mistaken, your new book, Daily Creative, is coming out, right? Firstly, many,
Yes.
many congratulations on that. And it seems to me, I've not read it, but I'm going to read it. And as soon as I get it, I'll let you know my feedback as well. It seems as the book is the atomic habits for addressing the Achilles heel of ideas are plenty, but ideas without action are regrets.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Well, what it's designed to do is to help people build a daily practice around their creativity, meaning their problem solving. What I've discovered over the course of the last couple of decades of doing this work is that the people who succeed long term are those who have an everyday practice around their creativity, meaning that they build rituals and practices into their life to sustain them. They have infrastructure to sustain them. And so what I wanted to do with Daily Creative was offer every day 366 bite-sized essays. So think, it takes a minute and a half to 2 minutes to read, and a corresponding challenge to provoke them to think in new ways about their work. And it could be their collaboration, it could be their leadership, it could be how they come up with ideas. There are 366 different topics, but the idea is to give people new ways of thinking about and approaching their work every single day. And to create a cadence of people having those conversations about that topic every single day.
You wear multiple hats, right? You're author, speaker, trainer, podcaster. What is the hat that you actually relish wearing?
I love to teach. That is the thing that's truly my vocation. We all have occupations and we have vocations. I write in order to be able to teach principles to people. And so I love being in front of people. I love teaching ideas and principles to people. That's really what I love. That's the task I love. So I don't love to write, even though I've written 6 books and published 6 books. I don't love to write, but I love having written, and I love the outcome of that, which is I get to teach people these principles that I've been developing over the last several decades.
Lovely. Keep going, keep going. So before I
Thank
let
you.
you go, I'm sensitive of the time, Todd. Just tell us which are the books and people that have inspired you, in your journey.
So I'll share a couple. The book that started my journey as a podcaster and as an author was Purple Cow by Seth Godin. And I actually just sent a copy of Daily Creative to him and wrote him a little note and said, "Hey, I would not be doing this if it wasn't for you." And we've interacted several times over the years, but I'm just continually grateful for that book and how it inspired me to think in a different way about the work that I'm bringing into the world. So that was a really phenomenal book for me. Probably the most influential nonfiction book, other nonfiction book is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, which really challenged me in a lot of ways. But one of the core principles I took out of it is instead of asking what I want out of life, I should stop and begin asking what life is asking of me. So, what is it that life is calling out of me in response to what I'm experiencing? And I need to go seek ways of adding that value to the world around me according to what I'm uniquely capable of bringing. So I would say those two books probably were tremendously influential to me. Purple Cow by Seth Godin and Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl.
And any personalities you would add to that in terms of leaders or people that actually played a huge part in terms of what you are currently?
So I would say early on, so with I mean obvious caveats about sort of early dysfunctions and sort of, I mean, as you find in many leaders, right? You find, I mean, there's the yin and the yang, the good and the bad. There's the shadow side of every talent, every gift. And I know this is a bit of a cliche, but I would say Steve Jobs. He had a vision at a time. People take for granted that the personal computer is a thing, but at the time, the idea of we're going to put a personal computer on every desktop, that was ludicrous. That was a ludicrous idea that we were going to do that. So for
Well,
someone to have a
before
vision
words
that
like moonshot was invented.
absolutely, that's exactly right. And then the idea of, okay, now we're going to invent a touch screen and we're going to put a computing device in everybody's pocket that is infinitely more powerful than that personal computer that was on their desk 20 years ago or whatever. Just the ability to have a vision. I know he wasn't alone, and he had a lot of great people around him. But the ability to have a vision and to pursue that vision and bring something into the world, I think that he's probably one of the singular figures in the last couple of centuries who has influenced the world the most through technology. And so that's been really inspiring to me.
All right. Okay. Wonderful, Todd. Thank you so much. This is short, inspiring, motivational. We'll be in touch. And thank you so much for doing this. I'll get in touch with you as soon as this goes live.
Wonderful. Thank you so
All right.
much.
Thank you. Good luck with you and have a lovely day.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.